Funding for Quiet Valor and Silent Strength is made possible by generous support from ASC, ensuring access to an excellent, relevant, and sustainable cultural community for the Charlotte-Mecklenburg region.
Rugged battlefields were less than level playing fields for one group who helped change America.
Black folk understood that the Civil War was a transformative moment for African Americans.
Within the ranks of the U.S. colored troops were many individuals who evolved from slavery to the military in a personal quest for equality.
We are responsible for one of the few destructions of a Confederate army in the field.
Remarkable achievements didn't just come on the ground, but also through assignments on the high seas.
They're just as courageous, just as dedicated.
Anniversaries acknowledging their accomplishments do bring honor and offer the reminders of principle and purpose.
We had a position to uphold for not only our families, but to help break that chain of slavery.
The Veterans National Cemetery here in Salisbury, North Carolina has not always been under the watch of the federal government. During the 1860s, this graveyard served as a lockup run by Confederate forces. Hello and welcome. I'm Steve Crump. Hundreds of African American servicemen known as the U.S. colored troops were incarcerated at this very place as the Civil War rolled on. Some were slaves, others free men, all with the goal of full citizenship. Many of their achievements and accomplishments have gone unnoticed and underappreciated. This is an attempt to give life to such a meaningful legacy. Historians say they numbered nearly 200,000 individuals who carried out the qualities of quiet valor and silent strength.
In the often measured and recorded timelines and datelines of wars fought on American soil, Appomattox, Virginia is credited as a place known for bringing cohesiveness to a nation divided. The famous McLean House still stands on a very public site, managed and maintained by the National Park Service. It is where Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant, thus ending the Civil War on April 9, 1865. Heralded reminders of a celebrated past are stitched across this community. Large groups of tourists constantly visit these grounds and in many instances miss out on a telling subplot that oftentimes doesn't show up in textbook stories or classroom lessons. Factual written accounts regarding conflict and remembrance of a specific incident at the end of the war routinely appear as an afterthought. A very important, impactful storyline is blatantly absent from countless narratives from this locale. It speaks to the undeniable role and remarkable contribution made by these brave and courageous men who filled the ranks of the U.S. colored troops, better known as the USCTs.
They are here in force blocking the Confederate escape route. They play a critical role in this particular campaign.
Right, they're going to relieve Custer's Cavalry Division, which is up here on the ridge behind me, and they're going to come up and reinforce, and they're going to lock that door, if you will.
Their role at Appomattox is a culmination of their contributions to Union victory in the Virginia theater.
In her book titled Appomattox, Victory, Defeat, and Freedom at the End of the Civil War, University of Virginia history professor Dr. Elizabeth Varon writes, "So deeply did the case for USCT heroism resonate that the epigram, 'The last guns fired at Lee's army were in the hands of Negro soldiers.'"
And they see this moment as providential, as just retribution to the slaveholding oppressors, and as a sign that Providence has favored the righteous in this final moment.
Appomattox was part of a progression of the destruction of General Lee's army. They had lost Richmond.
Despite the morbid and horrific outcomes of far too many fatal fights, from Vicksburg, Mississippi to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and destinations of conflict in between, Appomattox landed the final blow and closing spike against the Confederacy. General Lee and his men were now at the end.
We used to think there were about 2,000 USCTs that were here at Appomattox. We now know there were a great many more, about 5,500 that were here on the morning of April 9th, fighting in the final battle that led directly to Lee's surrender.
Profound words were clearly articulated by former slaves who endured the years of war and recalled their experiences for interviewers from the Works Progress Administration. Vivid accounts were shared by some black surviving soldiers, and William Harrison, who was near the Appomattox Courthouse at the time of the surrender, relived the moment by saying, quote, "I was with General Grant when Lee surrendered at Appomattox. That was freedom."
Things that they went through, that they had to endure, persevere, is just absolutely astronomical compared to, say, modern soldiers today.
Nearly 2 years into this history-altering battle, President Abraham Lincoln fired one of the loudest shots without lifting a single firearm. He signed the Emancipation Proclamation. The document boldly signaled that freedom was within the grasp of the millions who were enslaved. Not long after Lincoln's game-changing executive order, well-publicized advertisements blanketed the country, offering new opportunities to men of color. Groundbreaking recruitment efforts were endorsed with enthusiasm by the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who had 2 sons that served in the Union Army.
And as Frederick Douglass said, once you wear the eagle on your chest and shed blood for your country, freedom would have to come.
The feds didn't go at it alone. Before emancipation, a number of states in the North and South carried out similar exercises backing the Union.
Prior to that, you had state organizations like the 54th Massachusetts, like the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, but they weren't really official. They weren't really authorized by the federal government.
So when you look at Kansas and South Carolina and other places where there was a manpower need, people didn't necessarily wait for the federal government to say, okay, we're going to approve you to do this.
So you have men who are runaway slaves, and you have men who are very, very highly educated. But they all have one goal in common, and that's the freedom not only for themselves, but for their people.
These units, whether they're raised in Camp William Penn in Philadelphia, or Camp Nelson, Kentucky, or anywhere across the North, are taking in men from all over.
Like so many other national cemeteries, the letters USCT are chiseled into the grave markers of Civil War veterans at Camp Nelson, Kentucky. During the 1860s, the installation south of Lexington served as a large recruitment center. While white officers commanded the black units, some enlisted men of color eventually made it up the chain of command. Still, there would be other disparities.
We know that there was discrimination in pay, that white soldiers were paid more per month than black soldiers, $13 to $10. Black soldiers also had fees for their uniforms taken out of that $10 wage.
Slaves who will yell and scream about getting only $10 a month are fascinating portraits of dignity, because these men are just fighting to become free, and they have never been paid for anything else in history, but they know it's unfair.
In his analysis of the military effort titled Lincoln and the U.S. Colored Troops, Dr. John David Smith of UNC Charlotte states the case that black soldiers received discriminatory duties, inferior assignments, inadequate care, insufficient training, and insults from white soldiers.
Early in the Civil War, Lincoln offered compensated emancipation to loyal slaveholders, starting with Delaware.
Many of their owners in 1864 found out that they could take them to the local county seat, let them enlist, and they got the bounty, or the enlistment bonus that they talk about.
Published accounts say bonuses went to slave owners from the U.S. government, in some cases paying them hundreds of dollars per soldier. While profits came to plantation owners, many of the have-nots embraced an allegiance of purpose and personal liberation.
When Frederick Douglass made the call to put a brass eagle plate on the chest, a bullet in their pocket, and a rifle on their shoulder, I think that resonated to a lot of these men.
Claiming the right to fight for these men of color
wasn't easily embraced with open arms.
We're not sure whether or not slaves are responsible enough for guns. Are they going to turn their guns upon the white men who have tormented them?
When you look at sort of the experience of black soldiers, it's not going to be necessarily uniform throughout the South. It's going to reflect the local politics.
In comprehending the cause for the benefits of African American military training and service, history professor Dr. Marcus Cox of the Citadel states, military training was introduced to further promote virtues of self-discipline, order, punctuality, and character in his book, Segregated Soldiers.
There was this sort of debate or this huge question whether black men would fight or would they would turn tail.
Valor was recognized at Port Hudson, Louisiana in May of 1863 when the 2nd Louisiana Colored Regiment made it onto the pages of Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper.
We are there to beat the Confederacy at its game of we believe in slavery, we don't believe in Negro soldiers. We're there for those moments.
Throughout Virginia, roadside signs recognize the character of these troops in conflict, but some skirmishes across the Commonwealth brought hardship. In Saltville, Virginia, during the fall of 1864, 114 black men died in battle here. Reports say nearly 50 black troops were intentionally massacred. On July 30th of that year, the Petersburg National Battlefield was the site of the Battle of the Crater. More than 1,300 USCTs would lose their lives, widely blamed on a horrific underground explosion.
The black troops at the Battle of the Crater are just poured in, almost a human wave attack, in the wrong place.
Diversity of the past is embraced at the entrance of the former battle site at Fort Lusty, Florida, 50 miles west of Jacksonville. An engraved marker honors the ultimate sacrifice of the 1st North Carolina Volunteer Unit, the 54th Massachusetts Volunteers, and the 8th Colored Troops from South Carolina.
The 8th USCT, that's also here, had been, their first trial by fire had been at Lusty, Florida in February of 1864. A relatively unknown battle, small scale, but for those men involved in it, it was an absolute bloodbath. They lose 310 men.
Living survivors from the fighting at Fort Lusty were sent to this destination, still known for its heinous environment.
Andersonville is just a horrifying prison, and sadly it was not unique.
Captured troops held at Andersonville, Georgia, weren't protected by many of today's so-called safeguards for prisoners of war, such as the Geneva Convention.
Black soldiers were given the absolute worst treatment. Denied food, denied medical care, denied clothing, had to sleep in the cold. It was horrible.
Horrible is the word used on many occasions to describe the relentless assault at Fort Pillow near Memphis, Tennessee, under the leadership of Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest. The level of carnage loudly amplified man's inhumanity. When it came to rounding up black soldiers, aggressive Confederate troops on April 12, 1864, subscribed to the mindset of take no prisoners alive.
African American soldiers, wounded soldiers, captured soldiers, soldiers surrendering, are murdered in cold blood rather than taken to prison of war camps.
Now a state park on the Mississippi River, this replica of the fort offers a solemn reminder that 550 black soldiers stood guard on these grounds at the time of the attack. Historians have written that even in the act of surrendering, 2/3 of the USCTs would be killed at Fort Pillow.
It was common knowledge that this was going on, but do you realize that African Americans still volunteered to fight?
This war was responsible for more than 600,000 casualties, the most of any U.S. conflict. But a large number of deaths didn't come from violence on the battlefield.
Many more black soldiers will die of disease than of combat, and that was true of white soldiers too. But black soldiers were at even an additional disadvantage. That is to say, sick black soldiers were much more likely to die than white soldiers were because the medical care for them was poorer than medical care for white soldiers.
Death would also be a sentence carried out to black soldiers who broke the law. In 1861, Private William Johnson of New York's 1st Cavalry was executed by Union forces on charges of desertion. Etched headstones pay tribute to the heavy sacrifice of service made by a group of USCT members along US 60 just east of Louisville in Simpsonville, Kentucky. Death didn't come to these men on the battlefield, but rather 22 lives were taken as they were moving cattle into the Commonwealth's largest city. Black troops in this case were the victims of a planned assault. Honoring the war dead, in many instances, is a ritual of reverence rooted in respect. Charleston, South Carolina's harbor offers a timely and scenic backdrop. It is where reenactors and admirers of the USCT chartered a tour boat to a destination of meaning. This group isn't heading to just any locale, but one of soul-searching reverence. Passing Fort Sumter, where the Civil War began, evokes heartfelt curiosity. But coming into view across the channel is Morris Island. The soil here is where a number of fallen members of the 54th Massachusetts Volunteers took their last breaths.
I'm still to this day amazed at how active and involved, black soldiers were in this particular area.
Morris Island is home to Fort Wagner, and the very place that brought the story of the USCTs to life in the 1989 Oscar-winning film, Glory.
Fort Wagner is a hugely important moment. I think it's now the one we know the most about because of the wonderful movie Glory. It's the image that comes to mind.
Reenactors from the 54th are committed to never allowing the memory of those who fought at the stronghold of the Confederacy to fade away. That's why tributes are held every year on this island.
We know more about the men of the 54th because most of those men were educated prior to the Civil War. They could be educated. It was legal for them to be educated.
While the recollections of artists at Fort Wagner reveal heavy fighting, historians say battlefield accounts spell out the fact that African American servicemen were the first to charge the fort.
The 54th Massachusetts did not include former slaves. These were men who had grown up in freedom and were recruited in the North.
A salute of gunfire, a wreath of remembrance, and the refrain of this defiant spiritual inspires reflection during a somber occasion.
And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free.
The visit to Morris Island didn't end their mission. Reenactors representing Company I of the 54th had one more stop to make in Charleston.
Company, rest on arms, march!
In June of 2015, 9 African Americans were slain during an evening of Bible study, including the congregation's minister, Clemente Pinckney, at Mother Emanuel AME Church. Having a presence at this place of worship seemed only fitting for those who honor the 54th Massachusetts Volunteers. The Charleston 9 also holds a very special place in their hearts.
They were sacrificial lambs for the cause of justice and freedom.
Pennsylvania Avenue, one of America's best-known avenues, and along such a famous parade route, this celebrated Grand Review honored the accomplishments of many of those who never tasted the fruits of thankful recognition. During May of 2015, dedicated guardsmen of a proud past embraced the heroic deeds made by their pioneering role models.
It's sort of a new age to where we get to tell our story.
One emerging story offering solid testament and conviction displayed by the USCTs is now slowly finding mainstream approval. It speaks of a major milestone showcasing heroic accomplishment.
14 African Americans received the Medal of Honor. It was now called the Congressional Medal of Honor, but it was then called the Medal of Honor. And the service at the attack on Newmarket Heights was absolutely phenomenal.
While USCT troops are widely credited for their role in the fall of Richmond, 25 miles southeast from the capital of the Confederacy on Virginia's Highway 5, New Market Heights offered an intense proving ground.
These particular battles establish African Americans as real soldiers in the American Army.
The 14 decorated individuals include Kelly Alexander, Powhatan Beatty, Christian Fleetwood, James Gardner, and Thomas Hawkins.
There are some battles where African Americans performed spectacularly because by then they had proven their mettle in combat and they were needed.
The nation's battlefields were not the only places that a call for national defense was answered. Service performed by men of color also came at sea.
As the war starts, there's a small number. That number will go up very dramatically to about 18,000. This will constitute nearly a quarter of the Union Navy.
Washington, D.C.'s busy intersection of 10th and U is home to a much-esteemed place, paying tribute to those who fell and those who survived. Portraits of great pride greet visitors to the Museum of the American Civil War, and one of the prize showcase pieces is a statue titled Spirit of Freedom. It is the work of sculptor Ed Hamilton.
I've got to put my soul and think in regard to who these men are and what they've done and what they have accomplished.
The creation goes well beyond accomplishments. It offers stirring inspiration of self-actualization.
You cannot get a better testament of, at last, somebody I can look out here in this public sector. It looks like me.
As the unearthed achievements of these individuals find favor, a growing number of accolades come into public view. Tributes can be found in more than a dozen states, and in Monroe, North Carolina, one such memorial recognizes black men who served in the Confederacy.
You're going to find a lot of Southern black men on the battlefield with the Confederate Army, not usually as combatants.
At South Carolina's Confederate Relic Room and Military Museum, a rare find from the 19th century greets visitors. The colors, once carried by these groundbreaking troops, occupy prominent wall space.
What's left of the silk flag of the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, a unit which was later renumbered as the 34th USCT, United States Colored Troops. It's a flag in pretty rough condition. It's a flag under which, at one point, Harriet Tubman may have walked, since she acted as a guide for that unit.
Recreated flashbacks of 1865 dramatize the closing skirmishes of the American Civil War. What many see as hallowed grounds operated by the National Park Service at Appomattox, Virginia, set the stage for an active battlefield and 21st century takeaways. During 2015, visitors to this national site are absorbing new accounts, applauding the detailed actions and contributions of a special group of servicemen.
They are the first troops that blunt this attack that Lee makes trying to break out of here. They fought with distinction here, and they are men from all over.
Loyalty to the past was carried out on the part of those making such a personal pilgrimage to such a revered national landmark. While steady beats kept many in step, insightful dialogue during the events marking the 150th anniversary of the end of the war delivered timely context.
America in 2015 is not as sharply split as during the time of the Civil War, but anyone watching the news knows that we are too divided.
As Appomattox continues billing itself as a place of national unification, inclusion is now an important factor in acknowledging key contributions of the unsung.
For the black community, the military was the constant. That the belief was that if the military can prove that they were worthy as soldiers, then equality for the rest of the community would follow.
Individuals, despite the obvious disadvantages, who bravely shouldered insurmountable risk in spelling out and shaping their own destiny.
For African Americans, service in the U.S. Colored Troops made available to them, later at least, 3 boxes. First, they had the cartridge box. Then they had the ballot box. And then they would finally get the jury box.
This is what they fought for, and they did that since the Revolutionary War.
Foot soldiers of the 1800s whose courageous actions are acknowledged more than a century and a half later.
We now know they were in greater numbers. We now know that they were also diversified in their African heritage. We now know the many battles that they fought, their many achievements.
Many bloody and fatal skirmishes for these men would occur in places like Honey Hill, South Carolina, Milliken's Bend, Louisiana, and Nashville, Tennessee, to name just a few. Over 4 years, they would be responsible for fielding more than 160 units involving cavalry, artillery, and infantry. Out of the 200,000, just 18 would receive the Medal of Honor. However, they would open the door for units like the Buffalo Soldiers, the Tuskegee Airmen, and a very famous general by the name of Colin Powell. Their victory on American soil helped move a nation forward and allow these pioneering trailblazers to have a role in dismantling the peculiar institution known as American slavery. That's quiet valor and silent strength. From the National Veterans Cemetery in Salisbury, North Carolina, I'm Steve Crump. Thanks so much for joining us.